6 armed men surrounded the cabin. Silas Blackwell's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. 6 guns against a woman and some children. The math isn't in your favor, Mrs. Whitmore. Meg's finger tightened on the rifle trigger. Behind her, 3 little girls held their breath. The valley her father-in-law had hidden for 30 years was about to become a battlefield. But what those men didn't know was that the desperate mail-order bride they'd mocked 2 years ago had learned to shoot straight, and she had allies they'd never see coming. This is the story of how it all began. The richest ranch in 3 territories would one day belong to the woman who stepped off the train that morning with nothing but a borrowed coat and a battered suitcase. But as she stood on the platform facing a town's judgment, she didn't know that. All she knew was that 37 people were staring at her like she'd made the worst mistake of her life. The train hissed behind her, steam billowing white against the gray Montana sky. The platform creaked beneath her worn boots, each step announcing her presence like a confession. Cold wind cut through her thin coat, the kind that borrowed warmth never quite provides. She clutched her suitcase tighter, feeling the weight of everything she owned pressing against her palm. 2 dresses, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch. The sum total of 29 years reduced to what could fit in cracked leather. 37 faces. She'd counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when you're trying not to feel the weight of their stares. Women in their Sunday best, despite it being Thursday, hair coiled tight beneath bonnets, lips pursed in that particular expression reserved for witnessing someone else's shame. Men in work clothes and suspicion arms crossed, watching like she was livestock being evaluated at auction. The whispers started before her second step. "That's her," a woman's voice pitched to Carrie. "The mail-order bride. For Daniel Whitmore of all people." Another voice thick with pity that felt more like contempt. "That desperate woman doesn't know he can't even feed his own daughters." Margaret Wilson, called Meg by the few who'd bothered to learn her name, kept her chin up. 15 years in a Philadelphia garment factory had taught her how to endure scrutiny. Wealthy women examining seams for flaws, overlookers watching for the slightest hesitation that might justify docked wages, boarding house matrons tallying every moment past curfew. She'd survived all of it with her spine straight and her gaze forward. But this was different. This was a town, and she was the outsider who'd answered an advertisement from a man they'd already written off as a failure. Mrs. Edith Brennan stood at the center of the crowd like a general surveying troops. 55 years, merchant's wife, the kind of woman who wore her respectability like armor and wielded gossip like a sword. Her voice rose above the murmurs with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "A mail-order bride for Daniel Whitmore. Lord have mercy. Does she know his cattle are skin and bones? Does she know he can barely afford the rent on that falling down cabin? Does she know those poor girls wear dresses so patched they're more thread than fabric?" Meg felt heat crawl up her neck, but she didn't stop walking. Couldn't stop. Because there at the edge of the crowd, standing apart like he didn't quite belong to the judgment surrounding him, was the man she'd traveled 1,700 miles to marry. Daniel Whitmore held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, fingers worrying the brim. 36 years old, though his face carried more years in the lines around his eyes and the gray threading through dark hair. Tall, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat last. His shirt was clean but worn thin at the collar. His boots were scuffed but polished. There was care in the details even when there was nothing left to care with. His face was red, not from cold but from shame. The kind of shame that comes from standing in public while strangers dissect your failures and find you wanting. Behind him, 3 small figures huddled together. 3 girls with their father's dark hair and their late mother's delicate features. The oldest stood in front, protective arms, slightly spread as if she could shield her sisters from the world's cruelty through posture alone. The middle child hid behind her face, partially obscured, one hand clutching her sister's dress. The youngest simply stared, eyes wide and unnervingly direct, seeing everything and understanding more than a 6-year-old should. Their dresses were exactly as Mrs. Brennan had described. Patched. Clean, but patched. Hems let down and let down again until there was no more fabric to let. Shoes that pinched, judging by how the middle girl shifted her weight. But their hair was braided neatly. Their faces were clean. Someone had tried, someone had cared, even when caring took more energy than they probably had to spare. Meg's heart cracked open like ice under spring sun. She closed the distance between them, her suitcase bumping against her leg with each step. The crowd fell silent, watching, waiting to see how this tragedy would unfold. 20 feet, 15, 10. Daniel Whitmore looked up, and their eyes met for the first time in person. She'd seen his photograph sent with his letter. A formal portrait, stiff and serious, the kind you sit for at a studio with your best clothes and your worst anxiety. But photographs couldn't capture the exhaustion in a man's gaze, or the flicker of desperate hope that he was trying very hard to hide, or the way his jaw tightened when he glanced at the crowd and then back at her, as if apologizing for putting her through this. "Miss Wilson." His voice was quiet, roughened by years of swallowing words that might have made things harder. "I'm Daniel Whitmore. I'm glad you came. I know this ain't, I'm sure this isn't what you—" He trailed off the words, tangling somewhere between his intention and his tongue, his hand stilled on the hat brim. For a moment he just stood there, a man who'd forgotten how to finish a sentence in the face of public humiliation. Meg set down her suitcase. She extended her hand, formal, deliberate, making him meet her as an equal, not a supplicant. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for meeting me." His hand was warm, despite the cold scarred across the knuckles, calloused, in the way that comes from years of gripping tools and reins and responsibility. But his nails were clean, his palm was dry. Someone who cared about details even when there was no one left to notice. She noticed. Behind him, the oldest girl shifted forward half a step, protective, evaluating. This child had already learned to guard what little remained of her family. "These are my daughters," Daniel said, his voice steadier now, as if introducing them gave him purpose. "Annabeth and Grace." Anna was 12, though her eyes carried the weight of someone much older. She studied Meg with open suspicion, the kind of wariness that comes from losing one mother and learning not to trust replacements. Her hand rested on her middle sister's shoulder, proprietary defensive. Beth was 8, quiet in the way of children who've learned that silence is safety. She peeked out from behind Anna, her gaze flicking between Meg's face and the ground, never settling on either for long. There was something watchful about her, something that seemed to see past surfaces into stranger truths. Grace was 6, and she hadn't learned to hide anything yet. She stepped forward, breaking free from Anna's protective stance, and looked up at Meg with the kind of unflinching curiosity that only the very young possess. "Are you gonna be our new mama?" Her voice was clear, cutting through the tension like a bell through fog. Anna hissed her name. "Grace." But Grace didn't flinch. She just kept staring at Meg, waiting for an answer that would either confirm or deny the hope she'd been carrying since her father first mentioned sending for a wife. Meg knelt down, heedless of the dirt on the platform, bringing herself to Grace's eye level. The crowd pressed closer, eager to witness this moment of either connection or rejection. She could feel their attention like hands on her shoulders, pushing her toward failure. She ignored them, all of them. There was only this child and the question hanging between them like a fragile thing that could shatter with the wrong word. "I'm gonna try, sweetheart, if you'll let me." It wasn't a promise. She'd learned not to make promises she couldn't guarantee. But it was honest, and children had a way of hearing honesty even when adults missed it. Grace's face transformed uncertainty, giving way to something that looked dangerously close to joy. She didn't throw her arms around Meg, didn't collapse into easy affection. But she smiled, small and tentative, like she was practicing an expression she'd almost forgotten how to make. "Okay," Grace said simply. Then, with the matter apparently settled in her mind, she stepped back to her sisters. Anna's expression hadn't softened, but something flickered in her eyes. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of trust if Meg proved herself worthy. Beth remained hidden, but Meg caught the faintest nod, so small it might have been imagined. "Well," Daniel said, clearing his throat, the wagon's just over here." He picked up her suitcase before she could protest his movements, stiff with awareness of the watching crowd. Meg straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt, and followed him toward a wagon that had seen better decades. The crowd parted, but not silently. Mrs. Brennan's voice rose again, ostensibly addressed to her circle, but carefully pitched to Carrie. "I give it 3 months. She'll run back east when she realizes what poverty really is. Mark my words, that girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." the banker's wife chimed in, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Those poor girls, being raised by a desperate stranger? It's not right. Someone should speak to the Reverend. One voice, quieter than the others, tried to push back. Perhaps we should give her a chance. She seems... But the suggestion was drowned beneath a wave of knowing looks and pitying sighs, the collective judgment of people who'd already written the ending to a story that had barely begun. Meg kept walking. Daniel kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. The girls followed in a tight cluster, Anna's hand on Beth's shoulder, Beth's hand holding Grace's. The wagon was exactly what Meg had expected after reading Daniel's letters. Old, patched. The wheels needed oil, announcing their approach with a steady squeak that would have been comical in different circumstances. The horses were thin ribs, visible beneath dull coats, but they'd been brushed. Their manes were combed free of tangles. Someone had taken the time to care for them, even when there wasn't enough to give. Daniel lifted the suitcase into the wagon bed with more care than its battered condition deserved, then turned to help Meg up. His hand was steady as she stepped onto the wheel hub and into the seat. The girls climbed into the back, settling among feed sacks and carefully folded blankets that were likely meant for the horses but served double duty as cushions. Ready, Daniel asked, his voice low, meant only for her. Meg nodded. She wasn't. She had no idea if she was ready for any of this, but ready or not, the train had already left, carrying away her last chance to reconsider. Daniel clicked his tongue and the horses lurched forward. The wagon creaked, the wheels squeaked, and behind them the town watched them leave with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed the beginning of an inevitable disaster. They didn't speak for the first mile. The road stretched before them, rutted dirt cutting through landscape that was beautiful in its harshness. Rolling plains stretched toward distant mountains, grass yellowed by approaching winter skies so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. The air smelled of earth and distance and the particular emptiness that comes with wide open spaces. Behind them in the wagon bed, Anna finally spoke. "Can you cook?" Her tone was challenging, testing. This was an interrogation disguised as conversation, and everyone in the wagon knew it. Meg turned slightly enough to see the girl's face without fully abandoning forward vision. "I can. Nothing fancy. Stewed red beans. I worked in a factory for 15 years. We took turns cooking for the boarding house." "Can you mend?" "Yes, I was a seamstress. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for longer than you've been alive." Anna's expression shifted, calculation replacing some of the suspicion. A seamstress was useful. A seamstress could make worn things last longer. "Can you read, Kun?" "Yes, my father taught me before he died. I can write too and do arithmetic." This answer landed differently. Anna's eyes widened, slightly surprised, breaking through her defensive posture. Reading was one thing. Many women could read at least enough to get through a Bible or a simple letter. But writing arithmetic, that was education. Real education, the kind that opened doors and created possibilities. "Mama could read," Anna said softly, and for the first time her voice carried something other than challenge. "She used to read to us every night, stories about faraway places." "Your mama sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Meg said, carefully navigating the minefield of a dead woman's memory. "She was." Anna's voice hardened again, protective. "She was the best mama in the world." "I believe you." They fell silent again, but it was a different silence now. Not quite comfortable, but no longer hostile. A truce temporary and fragile, but real. Beth leaned forward, her small voice barely audible over the wagon's noise. "There's a rabbit at home. I've been trying to help it. Its leg was broken. Do you think I'm doing it right?" The question was offered like a gift, tentative and precious. An invitation to enter her world, if only Meg knew how to accept it properly. "I don't know much about rabbits," Meg admitted, "but I'd like to learn. Maybe you could teach me." Beth's face brightened, transformation swift and startling. "Really, Winlaw?" "Really?" Grace, who'd been quiet until now, suddenly scrambled forward, clambering between the seats until she could settle partially on Meg's lap. The movement was so quick, so trusting, that Meg barely had time to adjust before finding herself with an armful of 6-year-old. "Grace," Daniel said, warning in his tone, "give Miss Wilson some space." "It's all right," Meg said quickly. She wrapped one arm around the child, steadying her against the wagon's sway. Grace was warm and solid and smelled of soap and wood smoke. Her hair, braided but coming loose, tickled Meg's chin. Grace tilted her head back, studying Meg's face with that same unnerving directness. You're pretty. Not like Mama. Mama had yellow hair, but you're pretty different. Grace, Anna's voice was sharp with horror at the perceived rudeness. But Meg laughed, the sound surprising herself. Thank you, Grace. I think that might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in a very long time. Grace beamed vindicated and settled more comfortably into Meg's lap. Within minutes, lulled by the wagon's rhythm and the afternoon warmth, she was asleep, her head heavy against Meg's shoulder. Daniel glanced over, his expression unreadable. She's not normally that trusting with strangers. Maybe I'm not a stranger anymore, Meg said quietly. Something flickered across his face. Hope, maybe, or fear that Hope would be disappointed again. He turned back to the road, but his shoulders seemed slightly less rigid. The landscape rolled past, miles of grass and sky in silence, broken only by the wagon's creaking and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. The sun tracked westward, painting everything gold and amber, making even the harshness look beautiful in the fading light. After an hour, the road crested a small rise and Daniel pulled the horses to a stop. There, he said, pointing. Below them, in a shallow valley carved by a creek that caught the sunlight like scattered silver, stood his ranch. Calling it modest would have been generous. The cabin leaned slightly to one side as if tired of standing upright. The roof was a patchwork of shingles and tar paper repairs layered upon repairs. The fence around the small yard sagged in places, held up more by habit than structural integrity. A barn stood nearby, not quite falling down, but clearly considering it as a future option. 7 cattle grazed in a pasture that had seen better grass. Chickens scratched in the dirt near the cabin. Somewhere a creek burbled its way through the property, the sound carrying on the wind. It was falling apart. It was barely holding together. It was everything his letters had warned her about, and nothing she'd been able to truly imagine. And it was clean. The yard was swept. The windows, though cracked, were clear. Laundry hung on a line, flapping in the breeze, patches visible even from this distance, but obviously cared for. Someone had planted flowers once, and though they were mostly wild now, you could still see the intention in their arrangement. It's not much, Daniel said, his voice tight with the kind of shame that comes from showing someone your failures in daylight. I know it's not what you probably expected. I tried to explain in the letters, but it's honest, Meg interrupted. She meant it. The cabin might be falling apart, but it wasn't pretending to be something it wasn't. There was dignity in that. And it's clean. That matters more than you might think. He looked at her, then really looked, as if trying to determine whether she was being kind of truthful or simply making the best of a terrible situation. Whatever he saw in her face made something in his expression soften. Girls worked hard on cleaning this morning, he said. They wanted things to look nice for you. Meg's throat tightened. These children, who had so little, had spent their morning making things presentable for a stranger who might reject them. The weight of that effort, that hope, settled in her chest like a stone. Then I'm honored, she said, truly. Daniel clicked to the horses and they descended the gentle slope toward what would now be home. As they approached, details became clearer. The cabin had 2 rooms, maybe 3, if you counted what looked like a lean-to addition. The barn's door hung slightly askew. The well pump needed priming, judging by the bucket of water sitting beside it. But there were curtains in the windows. Someone had carved animals into the porch railing, whimsical touches that spoke of hours spent trying to make something beautiful out of nothing. A child's handprint was pressed into a patch of dried mud near the door, preserved either by accident or intention. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. He climbed down, then turned to help Meg, his hands careful on her waist as she stepped to the ground. Grace was still asleep, and he lifted her with practiced ease, cradling her against his shoulder. Annabeth helped Miss Wilson with her bag, he said quietly. The girl scrambled down Anna, retrieving the suitcase with determination, despite it being nearly as big as she was. Beth took one handle, and together they managed to carry it toward the cabin. Inside the cabin smelled of wood smoke and lye soap and something baking that made Meg's stomach remind her she hadn't eaten since dawn. The main room was small but organized with the kind of precision that comes from having too many people in too little space. A table handmade with benches on either side. A fireplace, the hearthstones blackened by years of use. Shelves holding dishes, books, a few treasured objects that had survived poverty through sheer determination. And there on the mantel photographs, a woman with kind eyes and pale hair holding a baby. The same woman older laughing at something outside the frame. A family portrait formal and stiff, but you could see the love and how close they all stood together. Catherine, Daniel's first wife, the girl's mother, the woman whose absence filled this cabin like smoke, invisible but inescapable. Meg felt that absence press against her like a physical thing. She would never measure up to memory. Memory was perfect because it was finished. Memory didn't have bad days or lose patience or fail to understand what children needed. Memory was a ghost that would always be welcome in this house, and Meg would always be the living woman who fell short by comparison. "That's Mama," Grace said, suddenly awake and pointing at the photographs. She'd climbed down from her father's arms and now stood beside Meg, small hand reaching up to tug at her skirt. "She was beautiful. She died when I was almost 3. I don't remember much, but Anna does. Anna remembers everything." "She was beautiful," Meg agreed quietly. "You have her eyes." Grace beamed at this, then seemed to remember something important. She tugged harder on Meg's skirt. "I need to show you something. Come on." Before Meg could respond, Grace grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back of the cabin. Through the main room past a curtain that separated the sleeping area, out a back door that led to a small yard. There beneath a cottonwood tree was a tiny grave. Not a person, too small for that. A stone marked the spot, and on it, carefully painted in a child's hand, "Molly, good doll, went to heaven." "I buried my doll," Grace explained matter-of-factly. "She was the one Mama made me. She got torn really bad and Papa said we didn't have fabric to fix her proper. So I buried her so she could be with Mama in heaven." Meg's heart cracked further, fractures spreading through carefully maintained composure. This child had so little that she'd held a funeral for a torn doll rather than accept that it was simply gone. She knelt beside Grace, heedless of the dirt, and pulled the girl into a hug. Grace allowed it, melting into the embrace with the kind of desperate relief that suggested she'd been hungry for this kind of comfort for a very long time. "That was very loving of you," Meg said, her voice thick. "I'm sure Molly knew how much you cared. Do you think Mama's taking care of her now?" "I think if there's any justice in heaven, yes." They stayed like that for a moment, woman and child kneeling beside a doll's grave in the fading light. Then Grace pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply. "Papa's been sad for a long time. Maybe you can help him not be sad anymore." Before Meg could formulate a response to that impossible request, Anna appeared in the doorway. "Supper's ready. Papa says come inside." They returned to find the table set with mismatched dishes and a meal that was simple but abundant. Stew thick with vegetables and small pieces of meat, bread fresh and still warm, milk for the children, coffee for the adults, weak but hot. Daniel stood at the head of the table, awkward in his own home, clearly unsure of the protocol for a first meal with a new wife. Meg solved the problem by simply sitting down at what was clearly Catherine's old place, the spot closest to the kitchen area where serving would be easiest. The girls took their usual seats, Grace between her sisters, all three watching to see what would happen next. Daniel sat slowly, as if expecting someone to object to this arrangement. When no one did, he cleared his throat. "We usually say grace," he began, then stopped, uncertainty crossing his face. "Unless you'd rather." "I'd like that," Meg said. "Please." They bowed their heads. Daniel's voice was quiet but steady. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for the hands that prepared it, and for bringing Miss Wilson safely to us. Help us be worthy of your blessings and worthy of each other. Amen." "Amen," the girls chorused. "Amen," Meg echoed. They ate in near silence, the kind that comes from hunger and long habit of not wasting energy on words when chewing required attention. The stew was good, well seasoned despite limited ingredients. The bread was slightly dense but edible, made with care if not expertise. Halfway through the meal, Beth spoke up. "Miss Wilson, do you know any songs?" "A few, why?" "Mama used to sing while we ate. It made things feel—" Beth trailed off, searching for the right word. "Warmer." "I can sing," Meg said, "though I should warn you my voice isn't anything special." "That's okay," Grace said immediately. "Neither was Mama's, but we loved it anyway." So Meg sang soft and slightly uncertain an old hymn her mother had favored. Her voice was exactly as advertised, nothing remarkable, but it filled the silence with something other than chewing and the scrape of spoons on bowls. When she finished, Anna was staring at her with an expression that might have been the beginning of acceptance. After supper, as Meg helped clear the dishes, she noticed Daniel kept reaching into his left coat pocket. His fingers would slip inside, touch something, then withdraw. Over and over, the gesture unconscious, automatic. The way you touch a talisman when you need reassurance that it's still there. Girls, get ready for bed, Daniel said. Anna, you are in charge of making sure everyone washes up proper. The girls obeyed with the practiced efficiency of children accustomed to routine. They disappeared behind the curtain, and Meg could hear water being poured, quiet voices, the rustle of clothes being changed. Daniel stood by the fireplace, still touching that pocket, staring at the flames with an expression that suggested he was somewhere else entirely. Mr. Whitmore, Meg approached carefully, the way you approach someone standing too close to an edge. Is everything all right? He jerked slightly, pulled from whatever dark place his thoughts had taken him. His hand fell away from his pocket, then rose again, helpless against the compulsion. I should show you the sleeping arrangements, he said, avoiding her question entirely. I fixed up the lean-to. It's small, but it's private. I put fresh straw in the mattress, and there's quilts. It gets cold at night, but the fireplace shares a wall so it stays tolerably warm. That's very thoughtful, thank you. He nodded, still not quite meeting her eyes. The girls sleep together in the main room behind that curtain. I usually sleep out here by the fire so I can keep it going through the night. But now that you're here, I figured you'd want your own space and I can... Mr. Whitmore. Meg waited until he looked at her. We don't have to figure everything out tonight. Let's just get through tonight and we'll see about tomorrow when it comes. Relief flooded his face, so profound it was almost painful to witness. All right, yes, that sounds good. The girls emerged from behind the curtain, scrubbed clean and dressed in nightgowns that had been mended so many times they were more patches than the original fabric. They climbed into the bed they shared, Anna in the middle with a sister on either side, the arrangement clearly long established. Good night, Papa, they chorused. Good night, girls. Say good night to Miss Wilson. Good night, Miss Wilson, they echoed, polite and practiced. Good night, Anna. Good night, Beth. Good night, Grace. Meg said each name deliberately, giving each child individual attention. Sleep well. Grace's voice drifted from the darkness. Will you still be here in the morning? The question hung in the air, weighted with every abandonment these children had already survived, and all the ones they feared might still come. Yes, Meg said firmly. I'll be here. Promise, I promise. Satisfied, Grace burrowed deeper into the blankets. Within minutes, her breathing had evened into sleep. Beth followed soon after. Only Anna remained awake, her eyes gleaming in the firelight, watching, waiting to see if this promise would be kept. Daniel showed Meg to the lean-to, carrying a lantern that cast shifting shadows on the walls. The space was exactly as he'd described. Small, clean. A bed with a fresh straw mattress and quilts that smelled of cedar from whatever trunk they'd been stored in. A nail on the wall for hanging clothes. A small window that looked out toward the creek. It was humble. It was sparse. It was more consideration than Meg had expected, given how little there was to work with. I know it's not, Daniel began. It's perfect, Meg interrupted. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Daniel, he said quietly. You can call me Daniel. We're married now. Seems foolish to stand on formality. Daniel, she repeated, testing the name in her mouth. Then you should call me Margaret. Or Meg. Most people call me Meg. Meg, he said, and there was something careful in the way he shaped the syllables, as if her name was a precious thing that might break if handled roughly. They stood there for a moment, two strangers who'd made permanent promises to each other based on letters and photographs, in desperation masquerading as hope. I'll let you get settled, Daniel said finally. If you need anything, just... I'll be fine, thank you. He nodded and turned to go, then stopped. His hand went to that pocket again, fingers slipping inside, touching whatever secret lived there. Meg. His voice was rough, scraped raw by something that might have been shame or fear or both. I'm sorry for all of this, for what you heard in town, for what you're seeing here. I tried to explain in the letters, but words on paper don't quite capture how bad things really are. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to catch the next train back east. I'd understand. I'd even help you with the fare somehow. Meg crossed the small space between them and placed her hand over his, stilling that compulsive reach toward his pocket. I read your letters, Daniel. Every word. I knew what I was agreeing to. Maybe not all the details, but enough. I'm not running. Not yet. Give me a chance to see if I can be useful here. His hand turned beneath hers palm to palm, and for a moment they stood connected by that simple touch. His hand was warm and rough and trembling very slightly. Thank you, he whispered, for staying, for trying, for not looking at my girls like they're charity cases. They're not charity cases. They're children who deserve better than they've gotten. And I'm not a saint swooping in to save anyone. I'm just a woman who answered an advertisement because I was tired of being alone in a city full of people. She pulled her hand back, and he let her go, though something in his expression suggested he would have held on if she'd allowed it. Good night, Daniel. Good night, Meg. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Meg stood alone in the lantern light, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around her, floorboards creaking as Daniel checked the fire, the whisper of quilts being adjusted as the girls shifted in sleep, the wind outside carrying the scent of approaching winter. She unpacked her suitcase by lantern light. The two dresses were hung on the nail. The brush was placed on the small shelf beside the bed. Her mother's Bible went on the shelf too, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Her father's pocket watch, the one luxury she'd kept through every hardship, was wound carefully and set beside the Bible. She changed into her nightgown, aware of the thin walls and the family just beyond them. Then she knelt beside the bed, hands folded, head bowed. She'd meant to pray, to ask for guidance, for strength, for wisdom to navigate this new life. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. Only exhaustion and a question that had no answer. What had she done? She climbed into bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. The mattress crackled softly beneath her weight. Through the window, stars were visible, bright and cold and indifferent to human struggles. Sleep should have come easily after the long journey. Instead, Meg lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this place that was supposed to be home. An owl called from somewhere near the creek. The cattle lowed softly in the barn. The fire popped and hissed as Daniel added another log, and beneath it all, the sound of breathing. 3 small girls and 1 tired man, all sleeping under the same roof, all depending on her to be something she wasn't sure she knew how to be. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, she'd figure out how to be useful. Tomorrow, she'd learn the rhythms of this household and find her place within them. Tomorrow, she'd prove to those children and to their father, and maybe even to herself, that answering that advertisement hadn't been the desperate mistake everyone in town assumed it was. Tomorrow. But tonight, in the darkness of a lean-to in Montana, Margaret Wilson lay awake and wondered if she'd made the worst decision of her life, or if everything that had come before had been preparation for this moment. Either way, it was too late to turn back now. The train had left. The promises had been made. And somewhere in the main room, a man was sitting by the fire, his hand in his pocket, touching something he hadn't shown her yet. Something that would change everything. She just didn't know it yet. Morning arrived with rooster crow and pale light filtering through frost-traced windows. Meg woke disoriented, forgetting for a moment where she was, why the ceiling looked unfamiliar, why the air smelled of wood smoke and prairie grass instead of coal smoke and unwashed bodies packed into boarding house rooms. Then memory returned. Montana, the ranch, Daniel Whitmore and his 3 daughters. The town's judgment still ringing in her ears like church bells calling sinners to account. She dressed quickly, fingers clumsy with cold, and emerged from the lean-to to find the household already awake and moving with practiced efficiency. Daniel was at the fireplace, coaxing flames back to life from overnight embers. Anna was at the table, slicing bread with careful precision. Beth had disappeared somewhere, probably to tend that injured rabbit. Grace sat on the floor, pulling on stockings that had been darned so many times they were more repair than original fabric. Morning, Daniel said, glancing up as she entered. His hair was damp face, freshly shaved, suggesting he had been up long enough to make himself presentable. Coffee's almost ready. I hope you slept all right. Well enough, thank you. It was a polite lie. She'd slept poorly, waking every hour to unfamiliar sounds, but there was no point in making him feel worse about accommodations he couldn't improve. Anna made biscuits. They're not fancy, but they'll fill you up. Anna set a plate on the table without meeting Meg's eyes, then retreated to the safety of the kitchen area. The biscuits were dense and slightly lopsided, made by hands that were still learning the balance between too much kneading and not enough. But they were warm, and when Meg took one and slathered it with butter, the taste was honest and good. "These are excellent, Anna," Meg said. "You have a steady hand with dough." Anna's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "Mama taught me, before she got too sick to stand at the counter." The ghost in the room. Catherine always present, always watching, always the measure against which Meg would be found wanting. Beth appeared in the doorway, her dress muddy at the hem, hands cupped carefully around something small and alive. "Miss Wilson, I wanted to show you. The rabbit. Its leg is healing, I think, but I'm not sure if the splint is too tight." She opened her hands enough for Meg to see watching a small gray rabbit, wild-eyed but oddly calm, with a splint made from twigs and strips of cloth bound around one hind leg. The work was careful, thoughtful, the kind of attention to detail that suggested this child had watched healing happen before and learned from observation. "May I?" Meg extended her hands, and Beth transferred the rabbit with the solemnity of someone passing along precious cargo. The animal's heartbeat thrummed against Meg's palms, fast and fragile. The splint was well-made, supportive, without cutting off circulation. The rabbit's eyes were clear, breathing unlabored. Whatever Beth had done, it was working. "This is beautiful work, Beth. The splint is perfect. Not too tight at all. How did you learn to do this?" "Mama knew about healing. She helped people sometimes when they were sick or hurt. She showed me things. How to check if bones were set right, how to make poultices, which plants were good for fevers." Beth's voice was soft but certain, speaking of knowledge passed from mother to daughter, like an inheritance more valuable than silver. "She taught you well. This rabbit is lucky you found it." Beth's face transformed, suspicion melting into something that looked like the beginning of trust. "I'll put him back in his box. He needs to rest." She disappeared again, carrying her patient with careful hands, and Meg felt something shift in the household's atmosphere. A small wall coming down, not completely, but enough to let light through. Daniel cleared his throat. "I need to ride into town today. We're running low on flour and coffee, and I promised to help fix the Reverend's fence. Should take most of the day." He didn't say what they both knew. That most of the day meant he'd be gone from dawn until well past dark, working for trade because cash was a luxury they couldn't afford. That the flour and coffee would be bought on credit they could barely service. That every debt incurred was another weight on shoulders already bowed. "The girls can show you around," he continued, "where things are kept, what needs doing. Anna knows the routine." "We'll be fine," Meg assured him. "Take whatever time you need." He nodded, clearly wanting to say more, but lacking the words or the courage to voice them. Instead, he reached into that left coat pocket again, fingers slipping inside, touching whatever lived there with the compulsion of a prayer or a curse. Then he was gone, the sound of horse hooves fading into morning mist, leaving Meg alone with 3 children who were still deciding whether to accept her or endure her. The first day unfolded in a series of small revelations. Anna showed her where things were kept with the efficiency of someone who'd been running a household since she was 9. Flour in the tin with the dented lid. Coffee in the wines with the crack that had to be positioned just right or it would leak. Soap made from lye and tallow, harsh but effective. The root cellar where vegetables were stored in sand, precious resources carefully rationed. "We had more," Anna said, not quite apologetic, but wanting Meg to understand. "Before Mama died, Papa had 40 head of cattle. Good breeding stock. But medical bills came, and then the funeral, and then we had a hard winter. Lost most of them to paid in or sold them to pay debts. Now we're down to 7, and 2 of those are so old they're practically useless." In the arithmetic of poverty calculated in cattle and coffee, and the slow erosion of everything that had once meant security. By the creek, Beth showed Meg her collection of healing plants. Yarrow for bleeding, comfrey for bones, willow bark for pain. Each plant carefully harvested, dried, stored in small pouches made from scraps of fabric. "Do people know you can do this?" Meg asked, watching Beth's careful hands sort through her supplies. "Some. Mrs. Cole, the Reverend's wife, she asks me for remedies sometimes. But most people think it's strange for a child to know these things. They think it's—" Beth hesitated, searching for the word. "Unnatural." "It's not unnatural, it's knowledge. Your mother gave you a gift." Beth looked up, eyes bright with something that might have been tears or relief or both. "That's what Papa says. but he's the only one. Grace, meanwhile, appointed herself Meg's constant companion, following her from room to room with questions that ranged from practical to philosophical. Why did you come here? Didn't you have family back east? Do you know how to make dolls? Can you read the big words in Papa's books? Do you think animals go to heaven? Do you miss your mama? That last question landed like a stone in still water ripples spreading outward. Yes, Meg said quietly, every day. Me too, Grace whispered. Then with the resilience of childhood, but maybe it hurts less if you have someone new to love. That's what Papa says anyway. The days fell into rhythm. Meg rose at dawn, started the fire, began breakfast, while Anna dressed her sisters and Beth tended to animals. Daniel left early and returned late, exhausted and silent, eating whatever was set before him with the mechanical efficiency of someone too tired to taste. Grace narrated the world in constant commentary, her voice filling silences that might otherwise have become unbearable. By the end of the first week, Meg had learned the ranch's rhythms. Water hauled from the creek each morning, 2 buckets at a time until her shoulders burned. Laundry on Monday, the physical labor of scrubbing and wringing, leaving her hands raw. Mending every evening by firelight, needle and thread, performing small resurrections on fabric too worn to last much longer. Cooking meals that stretched ingredients further than they should reasonably go, making abundance out of scarcity through stubborn determination. She found Catherine's cookbooks, pages stained and dog-eared margin notes in neat handwriting. Add more salt. Bake longer in winter. The girls prefer this with honey. A dead woman's voice, still teaching, still present. Meg followed those instructions exactly, not out of respect for the dead, but out of practicality. Catherine had learned this household's needs through years of trial and error. No point in reinventing recipes when the margins already held the answers. The second week brought the first genuine moment of connection. Evening after supper, as Meg sat mending one of Anna's dresses by lamplight, the girl approached slowly, carrying something wrapped in fabric. Miss Wilson, I wondered if, could you teach me something? Of course. What do you need? Anna unwrapped the fabric to reveal a book. Not a primer or a Bible, but a real book, the kind with stories and ideas. Papa bought this for me last year, before things got really bad. It's about a girl who becomes a teacher. But there are words I don't understand, and Papa works too hard to have energy for reading lessons at night. She held the book out like an offering, and Meg recognized the gesture for what it was. An invitation, a test, a reaching across the gap between stranger and family. I'd be happy to help. Shall we read together now, or would you prefer evenings after your sisters are asleep? Now, Anna's voice carried hope she was trying to hide. If it's not too much trouble. They sat together at the table lamp between them, and Meg began to read. Her voice found rhythm in the words, bringing the story alive. Anna leaned in, following along, asking questions that showed a sharp mind hungry for knowledge it had no way to access. Beth drifted over then, Grace, both girls drawn by the magnetic pull of story. Soon all three were pressed close, listening as Meg read about a girl not unlike Anna, fighting for education, in a world that thought women needed nothing beyond cooking and mending. Daniel came home to find them like that. 4 females around a lamp, heads bent toward the same book, his daughters' faces bright with attention. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching, and when Meg glanced up, she saw something in his expression that might have been gratitude or grief or the complicated mixture of both. That night, after the girls were asleep, he approached her in the lean-to doorway. Thank you, he said quietly, for reading to them. Catherine used to do that. I've tried, but after a day in the fields, I can barely keep my eyes open, let alone make words make sense. They're bright girls. They deserve chances to learn. They deserve a lot of things they're not getting. His voice turned bitter, self-recrimination, sharp as broken glass. New dresses, full bellies, a house that doesn't leak when it rains, a father who can provide more than broken promises and patched everything. They have a father who loves them. That counts for more than you think. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Love doesn't pay debts or put food on the table. His hand went to that pocket again, compulsive, automatic. Meg had been watching this gesture for 2 weeks now, curiosity building like pressure behind a dam. Whatever he kept there mattered enough to touch 100 times a day, to check constantly like he feared it might disappear. Daniel, what's in your pocket? The left one, you touch it constantly. He froze hand halfway to the fabric caught in the act. Color rose in his face, shame or embarrassment or both. It's nothing. Just something old, boss. It's not nothing. You reach for it when you're worried, when you're thinking about Catherine, when you look at the girls. Whatever it is, it means something. He stood silent for a long moment, war playing across his features. Then slowly he reached into the pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. The edges were soft, with handling the creases threatening to become tears. He held it like it might bite. My father gave me this, the day before he died. 5 years ago now. Catherine was still alive then, though she would die within days and things were, well, not good, but better than this. He stared at the paper, not offering it to her. He told me not to open it unless I had nothing left to lose. Said it was insurance, a way out when everything else failed. Have you opened it? No. The word was harsh, scraped raw. Because opening it means admitting he was right. About everything. About me being too proud. About Catherine dying because I wouldn't listen to sense. About me failing these girls just like I failed their mother. Meg stepped closer, close enough to see the fine tremor in his hands. What did he say about Catherine? Daniel's jaw tightened. The last thing he said to me standing in this very room while Catherine lay dying in that bed was, "You're killing her with your pride, boy. Stop asking her for more children and maybe she'll survive this one." And I threw him out. Told him he didn't know anything about love or marriage or family. Told him to leave and not come back. His voice broke. 2 days later, Catherine died. And a week after that, my father had a heart attack working in his fields. I didn't even get to apologize. Didn't get to tell him he was right, and I was a prideful fool. All I got was this letter from his lawyer in this sealed envelope with instructions not to open it except in dire emergency. And you think now qualifies as dire emergency? I think I'm being evicted in 6 weeks because I can't pay debts. I think my daughters are wearing dresses so patched, they're ashamed to go to town. I think I'm one bad winter away from losing everything and having to send these girls to orphanages because I can't feed them. His voice rose anger and despair mixing into something caustic. Yeah, Meg, I think this qualifies. She held out her hand. Then open it. I can't. Why not? Because if I open it and there's nothing inside except more disappointment, I don't know what I'll do. And if I open it and there is something some way out my father prepared, then I have to live with knowing I wasted 4 years being too stubborn to look. Meg kept her hand extended, patient waiting. You're in pain now, right this moment. Whatever that letter says can't hurt more than what you're already carrying. Open it. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the envelope. The seal was old wax, cracked at the edges, but still intact. He looked at it for a long moment, then at Meg, then back at the envelope. Will you? He swallowed hard. Will you read it? I don't think I can. She took the envelope, carefully broke the seal, and unfolded the letter inside. 2 pages covered in neat handwriting that had the same careful precision as the margin notes in Catherine's cookbooks. A man who thought before he wrote, who chose words with care. They read the letter together in silence, both pairs of eyes tracing the familiar words Samuel had written years ago. The message felt even more profound now, standing at the threshold of the valley he'd built for them. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. Daniel stood, frozen tears running unchecked down his face, hands opening and closing helplessly at his sides. He left me land, Daniel whispered. All this time he had land set aside and I was too angry to even look. Meg unfolded a second piece of paper that had been tucked inside the letter. A deed properly notarized transferring 320 acres from Samuel Wright to Daniel Whitmore, and on the back hand-drawn map with landmarks labeled in careful script. Split Rock, Eagles Peak, Whispering Pines, Three Sisters Falls. It is real, she said softly. Your father prepared this. For you. For your family. Daniel's legs seemed to give out. He sank onto the bench by the door, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs he'd been holding back for 4 years. The sound was raw, broken years of grief and guilt and loneliness pouring out in gasps that hurt to hear. Meg did the only thing she could think to do. She sat beside him, close but not touching, present but not demanding. Letting him break apart without trying to fix him. When he could speak again, his voice was hoarse. I threw him out. He came here trying to help, trying to save Catherine, and I threw him out because I was too proud to admit I was wrong. And then he died, and I never got to tell him I was sorry. Never got to tell him I loved him despite everything. He knew. Parents always know even when children cannot say the words. He left you this valley. That is forgiveness made solid. Daniel raised his head, eyes red and swollen. What do I do? The eviction notice says I have 6 weeks. Even if this valley exists, even if we could get there, what about the debts here? What about Silas Blackwell? He will not just let me walk away. Meg looked at the deed again, studying the details. This land is in a different county, different jurisdiction. Blackwell's claim is on this ranch, not on property he does not even know exists. You do not owe him anything beyond what the loan papers say, and we are documenting every payment. If we leave before the deadline, he cannot claim additional penalties. Leave? Daniel stared at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. Just pack up and go abandon everything. What is there to abandon? A cabin that leaks, land that barely produces, debts you cannot pay? Daniel, your father gave you a way out. Maybe we should take it. But the girls, Anna has friends here. Beth knows every healing plant within 5 miles. Grace was born in this cabin. This is their home. Home is not a building. Home is where their father can provide for them, where they do not have to wear dresses patched beyond repair, where they can eat until they are full instead of rationing every bite. Meg's voice turned fierce. Your daughters deserve better than watching you work yourself to death, trying to pay off a predatory loan to a man who wants you to fail. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope, if such a thing could be trusted. You would come to some unknown valley 3 days from anywhere. You have been here barely 2 weeks, and I am asking you to uproot again. I did not come here for the ranch, Daniel. I came because the alternative was dying alone in a boarding house, forgotten and unmourned. Your daughters need stability. You need a chance to succeed without impossible debts crushing you. If this valley is real, if your forefather truly prepared it, then yes, I will come. Daniel's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a grip that spoke of desperation and gratitude in equal measure. I do not deserve you. I do not deserve any of this. Deserving has nothing to do with it. We make do with what we have and try to build something better. That is all anyone can do. They sat like that for a moment, hands joined, two people who had known each other for mere weeks, making decisions that would reshape the rest of their lives. We should tell the girls in the morning, Daniel said finally. Give them time to say goodbye to friends, to this place. Agreed, Down. But Daniel, we need to keep the valley itself secret. If word spreads about your father leaving you valuable land, Blackwell might try to claim it somehow. Invent some debt your father owed. Forge documents. Better to simply disappear and let them think we fled in shame. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Let them believe we ran from failure. Let them believe whatever they want. We will know the truth. That night, Meg lay awake in the lean-to, listening to the ranch settle around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Telling the girls, planning the journey, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. But tonight, for the first time since arriving, she felt something that might have been hope. Somewhere 3 days north, there was a valley. And in that valley, there was a chance to build something real. A chance to give these children the childhood they deserved. A chance to prove that answering a mail-order bride advertisement had not been the desperate mistake everyone assumed. In the main room, Daniel sat by the fire staring at his father's letter. The words blurred through tears, but one phrase stood out, searing itself into his memory. Trust your new wife. A good woman can see things a man cannot. His father had been right about Catherine, had been right about pride, had been right about so many things Daniel had been too stubborn to acknowledge. Maybe he was right about this too. Maybe Meg was exactly what this family needed. Not a replacement for Catherine, but something new. Something that could grow into its own kind of strength. He folded the letter carefully, returned it to his pocket, and allowed himself for the first time in 4 years to imagine a future that did not end in failure. 3 days north, a valley waiting, a cabin his father built with his own hands, land that could sustain them. And whatever his father had found there, whatever valuable thing he'd mentioned, they would discover it together, as a family. The word felt strange and right in equal measure. Family. Not just his daughters, but Meg too. Margaret Wilson, who'd stepped off a train into judgment and chosen to stay. Who read to his girls and taught them their worth. Who saw the possibility of escape and spoke it aloud when he'd been too afraid to even imagine it. He would make this work. Whatever it took, however hard the journey, he would get his family to that valley. And once there, he would build them the life they deserved. His father had given him one last gift, one last chance at redemption. He would not waste it. Morning brought the hardest conversation Daniel had ever faced with his daughters. They sat together at the breakfast table, plates of porridge going cold, as he explained what their grandfather had left them, what it meant, what they would have to do. Anna's face cycled through disbelief, hope, and fear in rapid succession. Leave, just leave everything and go to some valley we've never seen. Your grandfather built it for us, for this exact situation. He knew someday we might need it. But what about Lucy? Anna's voice cracked. She's my only friend, and the Reverend's wife has been teaching me piano on Sundays. And I know every creek and tree for miles. This is home. I know, sweetheart. I know it's hard. Beth said nothing, just stared at her porridge with an expression that suggested she was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Finally, she looked up. The land is calling. I can feel it. It wants us there. Beth, that's foolish talk. Anna snapped, fear making her sharp. Land doesn't call a people. This land does. Beth's voice carried absolute certainty. Grandpa Samuel prepared it. He left something there. Something we need. Grace, too young to fully grasp the implications, simply asked, will there be room for a new doll? Since Molly's in heaven now. Daniel's throat tightened. Yes, sweetheart. There will be room for whatever you need. Meg had been silent until now, letting Daniel lead, but she spoke up with quiet authority. Girls, I know this is frightening. Change always is. But staying here means watching your father work himself to death, trying to pay debts to a man who wants him to fail. Leaving means a chance at something better. Not easy, but better. Anna's eyes filled with tears. You've only been here 2 weeks. You don't understand what we're losing. You're right, I don't. But I understand what you'll lose if you stay. I've seen poverty destroy families in Philadelphia. Watched children go hungry while their fathers broke themselves trying to provide. Your grandfather gave you an escape. Maybe we should take it. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and reluctant acceptance. Finally, Anna wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. How long do we have to say goodbye? 4 days, Daniel said. We need that time to pack, to prepare the wagon, to settle what we can here. Then we leave at dawn on the 5th day. Those 4 days passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Daniel sold what little they could spare. The 7 cattle went to a neighboring rancher for half what they were worth, but cash was cash. The chickens stayed with the Reverend's wife, who promised to care for them and asked no questions about why the Whitmore family was suddenly leaving. Anna spent hours with Lucy, the 2 girls sitting by the creek, making promises to write, even though both knew the likelihood of letters reaching an unknown valley was slim. They pressed flowers between book pages, exchanged small treasures, cried together in the way that only 12-year-old girls can cry when their world is breaking apart. Beth gathered her healing plants with methodical care, pressing and drying everything she could carry, making detailed notes about what grew where so she could find equivalents in their new home. She spoke little but moved with purpose, already preparing for a future she seemed to sense more clearly than the rest of them. Grace helped Meg pack her constant questions, a litany of anxiety disguised as curiosity. Will there be other children? Will I have my own bed? Can we bring the cat? Will Papa smile more? Will you still read to us? To each question, Meg answered honestly, I don't know, sweetheart. We'll find out together. On the 3rd day, Silas Blackwell rode up to the cabin, his expression smug with anticipated victory. He sat astride his horse like a conqueror surveying claimed territory. Whitmore, heard you're packing up, running away from your debts. Daniel stepped out onto the porch. Meg beside him, the girls watching from the window. Not running from anything, Blackwell. Leaving before your eviction deadline. You'll get your property right on schedule. And the money you owe on supplies, the credit extended in good faith. Paid in full yesterday. Got receipts if you want to see them. Silas's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. The cattle sale, meager as it was, had provided just enough to settle the few legitimate debts they carried. Where are you going? North. Got family up that way. Figure we'll try our luck somewhere else. It was vague enough to be believable, specific enough to sound planned. Silas studied Daniel's face, searching for deception, but found only exhaustion and resignation. Well, good riddance then. This town doesn't need failures bringing down property values. He turned his horse to leave, then paused. That wife of yours, the mail-order bride, she's staying with you or coming to her senses? Meg stepped forward before Daniel could respond. I made vows, Mr. Blackwell. I keep them. Whether that demonstrates sense or stubbornness, I suppose we'll find out. Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Respect maybe, or just surprise that she'd spoken at all. He tipped his hat mockingly and rode off, leaving dust and malice in equal measure. That man is poison, Meg said quietly. That man is this town, or at least what this town's become. Daniel's voice carried bitter understanding. People like him thrive because people like me are too tired to fight back. You're fighting back now, by leaving, by choosing your family over his greed. He looked at her, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite love, not yet, but recognition. Gratitude. The beginning of partnership that might, given time, grow into something deeper. Thank you, he said simply, for staying, for helping, for seeing possibilities when all I could see was failure. We're family now, Daniel. That means we face things together. The word hung between them. Family. Not his family that she had joined, but our family that they were building. The distinction mattered more than either of them could fully articulate. On the fourth day, they said their final goodbyes. The Reverend and his wife came by with food for the journey. Bread, dried meat, preserves that would keep. Small kindnesses from people who understood hardship. Where you're headed, you'll be beyond regular supply routes, Reverend Bull said. But if you ever need anything, you send word. We'll help however we can. Why? Daniel asked, genuinely puzzled. The rest of the town's happy to see me go. The rest of the town mistakes misfortune for moral failing. I know better. You're a good man, Daniel Whitmore. You've just had more than your share of bad luck. I pray this journey brings you better. Anna hugged Lucy one last time, both girls sobbing openly now. I'll write, Anna promised. Even if I don't know where to send it, I'll write everything down. So when we see each other again, I can tell you everything. When we see each other again, Lucy echoed, holding on to hope that both of them knew might be false. Beth knelt by the injured rabbit's box one final time. The creature's leg had healed well enough that it could hop short distances. She carried it outside, opened the box, and watched it disappear into the brush. You're free now, she whispered. Go find your family. Grace buried a small sachet beside Molly's grave. Inside were flower petals, a button from one of Catherine's dresses, and a lock of Grace's own hair. So Mama knows I haven't forgotten, she explained to Meg. Even if we're far away, she'll know I still love her. Meg knelt beside the child, throat tight with emotion. Your Mama knows, sweetheart. Mothers always know. Distance doesn't change love. That night, their last night in the cabin, Daniel couldn't sleep. He walked through rooms that had held his entire adult life. The fireplace where Catherine had taught Anna to cook. The window where Beth had watched birds and learned their habits. The corner where Grace had taken her first steps. Meg found him standing in the doorway of what had been his bedroom, the room where Catherine had died, where he'd slept alone for 4 years, rather than face the ghosts. Second thoughts, she asked quietly. Memories. This place holds everything I was, everything I failed to be. Leaving feels like abandoning it all. You're not abandoning anything. You're carrying it with you. Your daughters are your memories made flesh. Catherine lives in Anna's determination, Beth's healing touch, Grace's open heart. The cabin is just wood and nails. They are your legacy. He turned to look at her, this woman who'd known him mere weeks, but seemed to understand truths he'd spent years avoiding. How did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I've just seen enough loss to know the difference between what matters and what doesn't. Houses burn, possessions break, people endure. Your girls will endure because you're giving them a chance to thrive. He took her hand, the gesture still new enough to feel daring. I'm glad you're here. I don't think I could do this without you. You could, but you don't have to. That's what partnership means. They stood like that for a moment, hands joined in the darkness, two people learning to lean on each other instead of carrying everything alone. Dawn came cold and gray, the sky threatening rain. The wagon was packed to capacity, every available inch filled with necessities. Clothing tools, food seed for future planting, Catherine's cookbooks, the girls' few treasures. Daniel had fashioned a canvas cover to protect everything from weather, lashing it tight with rope that had been mended too many times. The girls climbed into the back, settling among the carefully arranged cargo. Anna sat closest to the front, where she could see the road ahead. Beth positioned herself near the side where she could watch the landscape pass. Grace nestled between them, clutching a small bundle that contained her most precious possessions. Meg sat beside Daniel on the driver's seat, the wagon creaking beneath their combined weight. He picked up the reins, then paused, looking back at the cabin one final time. Goodbye, he whispered. Thank you for the years you gave us. I'm sorry I couldn't make it work. Then he clicked his tongue and the horses lurched forward. The wagon rolled down the rutted path away from the only home these girls had ever known, toward an uncertain future in a valley none of them had seen. As they passed through town, curtains twitched. Faces appeared in windows. Mrs. Brennan stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching them leave with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions were coming true. There they go, she announced to anyone within earshot. Running away like thieves, that mail-order bride probably regrets her choices now. Meg heard every word. She kept her chin up, her gaze forward, and refused to give the woman the satisfaction of acknowledgement. They were 3 hours from town when they passed an old prospector walking the opposite direction, his burro laden with supplies. He was weathered and lean, 70 years, if he was a day, with eyes that had seen more than most men could imagine. He stepped aside to let the wagon pass, then called out, Daniel Whitmore, that you? Daniel pulled the horses to a stop, surprised. Do I know you? Pete Murphy, used to prospect with your father back in the old days. Heard you were leaving town, figured you might be heading north. Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. What makes you think that? Pete's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Your father saved my life once, pulled me out of a collapsed mine shaft when any sensible man would have left me for dead. I never forgot that. And I never told anyone about the valley he found up in Red Rock territory. Figured that was his business. The girls had gone silent in the wagon bed, listening. Meg tensed beside Daniel, uncertain whether this old man represented danger or deliverance. I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel said carefully. Sure you don't, and I'm not saying you do. I'm just saying if a man were headed up to Red Rock territory, he'd want to follow the old mining trails. Stay off the main roads where people ask questions. And he'd want to know that wolves have been active this season. Pack of 7, maybe 8, hunting the northern routes. Pete reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Also, if that man were to make such a journey, he might find this useful. Dried sage and sulfur. Wolves hate the smell. Burn a little in your campfire at night, they'll keep their distance. He tossed the pouch up to Daniel, who caught it reflexively. Why are you helping us? Meg asked, speaking for the first time. Pete looked at her with eyes that had seen too much sorrow to dismiss anyone's suffering. Because your husband's father showed me kindness when I needed it most. Because I'm old enough to know that hoarding good deeds is as foolish as hoarding gold. And because those girls deserve better than what this world's given them so far. He tipped his hat and continued on his way, his burro's hoofbeats fading into the morning mist. The valley isn't secret anymore, Anna said quietly from the wagon bed. One old prospector knowing isn't the same as the whole town knowing, Daniel replied. And he's right about the trails. We'll stay off the main roads. The first day of travel was deceptively easy. The weather held cold but dry, and the roads were passable. They made good time putting distance between themselves and the town that had watched them fail. But as afternoon stretched toward evening, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The temperature dropped. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and the promise of harder weather to come. We need to find shelter, Meg said, watching the storm approach with growing unease. There's an old way station about 2 miles ahead. Used to be for freight wagons. Might still be standing. They pushed the horses faster, racing the storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, deep and threatening. Lightning flickered on the horizon like celestial warnings. They reached the way station just as the first drops fell. It was barely more than a lean-to with 3 walls and a partial roof, but it was better than nothing. Daniel drove the wagon underneath the shelter, the horses stamping nervously as rain began to pound the earth with increasing fury. Within minutes, the storm hit with full force. Rain fell in sheets, turning the world gray and indistinct. Thunder cracked loud enough to make the girls cry out. Lightning illuminated everything in stark white flashes that left afterimages burned into vision. "Everyone stay in the wagon," Daniel ordered, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar. "The cover will keep you mostly dry." But the wagon wasn't completely waterproof. Water seeped through gaps in the canvas, dripping onto cargo and passengers alike. The temperature plummeted. Within an hour, everyone was shivering, teeth chattering, misery compounding misery. Grace pressed against Meg, seeking warmth that Meg didn't have to give. The child's lips were turning blue. Her skin felt clammy and cold beneath Meg's touch. "Daniel," Meg called, "Grace is getting too cold." He climbed into the wagon bed, wrapping Grace in every blanket they could spare, but it wasn't enough. The child was soaked through, shaking violently, her breathing shallow and rapid. "We need fire," Beth said with quiet urgency. "She needs warmth or she'll get sick." "Can't light a fire in this rain," Daniel said, frustration and fear warring in his voice. "Then we use our bodies. All of us together." Meg began arranging them, pressing close, sharing what little heat they had. Anna on one side, Beth on the other. Meg and Daniel creating a protective barrier around Grace in the center. The storm raged for hours. Thunder shook the ground. Lightning turned night into fractured day. Rain drummed against canvas with relentless percussion. And in the wagon bed, 5 people huddled together, sharing breath and warmth and fear in equal measure. Somewhere in those dark hours, Grace whispered, "I want Mama." The words cut deeper than any storm could reach. This child wanted her mother, the mother she barely remembered, the mother who died trying to give her father the son he'd wanted. And instead, she had Meg, a stranger who'd answered an advertisement and was already regretting the audacity of thinking she could replace someone irreplaceable. "I know, sweetheart," Meg whispered back, holding the child close. "I know, but I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. Promise. I promise." Grace's shivering gradually subsided. Her breathing evened. She slept finally, exhaustion, overwhelming discomfort. Meg stayed awake, Grace's weight warm against her chest, Daniel's presence solid beside her. This was what she'd signed up for. Not romance or comfort or security, but this, being present in the hard moments, holding a frightened child through a storm, sharing body heat in a leaking wagon while thunder shook the world apart. Daniel's hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a grip that spoke of gratitude and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for keeping your promise. For not running when things got hard. Where would I run to? This is home now. You and these girls. Wherever we end up, that's home." He pulled her closer, his other arm still wrapped around Grace, and they sat like that through the remainder of the storm. Not quite lovers, not quite partners, but something in between. 2 people learning to trust each other with the weight of survival. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and impossibly bright. The sun emerged like vindication, warming earth and bodies with democratic generosity. They emerged from the wagon stiff and exhausted but alive. Grace's fever, which Meg had feared would develop, never materialized. Beth's insistence on body heat had been exactly right. The child was tired and cranky, but fundamentally well. They ate a cold breakfast of bread and dried meat, too tired to attempt anything more complicated. Then they set out again, following Daniel's father's map, deeper into territory that grew increasingly wild and unfamiliar. The landscape changed around them. Gentle farmland gave way to rolling hills. Hills rose into foothills. Foothills climbed toward mountains that scraped the sky, with peaks still snow-covered despite the season. The air grew thinner, colder, cleaner. Pine trees replaced cottonwoods. Creeks ran faster, clearer, colder. And then just past noon on the second day, disaster struck. The road, such as it was, descended steeply into a ravine where a creek had swollen from the previous day's rain. Daniel guided the horses carefully, knowing that any misstep on the muddy slope could send the entire wagon tumbling. They were halfway across when it happened. The rear left wheel hit a submerged rock. The wheel cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon lurched sideways, throwing everyone off balance. Anna screamed. Beth grabbed Grace, holding her tight. Meg clutched the seat, her heart hammering, as the wagon teetered on the edge of complete disaster. Daniel fought the reins muscles, straining, voice sharp as he commanded the horses to hold steady. Somehow, through skill or luck or sheer desperation, he managed to get them across the creek and onto solid ground before the wagon collapsed onto its broken wheel. They sat in shocked silence for a moment, adrenaline making everything feel sharp and unreal. Then Daniel climbed down to assess the damage, and reality crashed back with crushing weight. The wheel was beyond repair. The hub had cracked, spokes had splintered, the iron rim had bent. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere with a wagon that couldn't move. "Can you fix it?" Meg asked, already knowing the answer. "On here, not with what we have. I'd need a forge proper tools, seasoned wood for the spokes." Daniel's voice was hollow with despair. "We're 2 days from town, maybe a day from the valley if the map is accurate. We can't go back. We can barely go forward." Beth climbed down and walked a slow circle around the wagon, studying the damage with eyes that saw more than broken wood. Finally, she knelt, pressed her hand to the earth, and went very still. "Beth," Anna called, "what are you doing?" "Listening." Beth's voice was distant, dreamy. "The land is telling me something." "The land doesn't talk, Beth." But Anna's voice lacked conviction. They'd all learned not to dismiss Beth's odd insights entirely. Beth stood, brushed dirt from her dress, and pointed northwest. "There's help, that way, not far. Someone who can fix the wheel or knows where we can get a replacement." "How could you possibly know that?" Daniel asked, torn between hope and skepticism. "I just know. The same way I knew the rabbit's leg would heal. The same way I knew the storm was coming. I listen, and the land tells me things." Meg and Daniel exchanged glances. Believing an 8-year-old's mystical certainty seemed absurd, but they were also stranded with few alternatives. "Northwest means toward the mountains," Daniel said slowly, "away from any settlements I know about." "Then maybe there's a settlement you don't know about," Meg suggested. "What do we have to lose? We can't stay here, and we can't fix the wheel ourselves." He looked at his daughters, at the broken wagon, at the vast wilderness surrounding them. Then he made a decision that felt equal parts faith and foolishness. "All right, we'll follow Beth's direction. But we can't take the whole wagon. We'll have to carry what we can and cache the rest. Mark the location, come back for it later if we can." They spent the next hours sorting supplies. Essentials came with them. Food, water, clothing, tools, Catherine's cookbooks, the girls' most treasured possessions. Everything else was carefully wrapped and hidden beneath the wagon's cover, protected as well as they could manage. Daniel fashioned rough packs from blankets and rope. Each person carried what they could manage. Even Grace shouldered a small bundle, determined to help despite her size. They set out northwest, following Beth's unwavering certainty through landscape that grew increasingly rugged. The terrain was beautiful in its harshness. Pine forests thick with shadow. Rocky outcroppings that looked like the earth's bones pushing through skin. Creeks that sang over stones, polished smooth by centuries of water. But beauty didn't make the journey easier. The packs grew heavier with each mile. Grace tired quickly, requiring frequent rests. Anna's earlier confidence in leaving home had eroded into quiet fear of the unknown, stretching endlessly before them. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Daniel began scouting for a place to camp. They needed shelter, water-level ground. The forest was thick here, visibility limited, and he didn't like how exposed they felt. That's when Beth stopped suddenly, head tilted like she was listening to something beyond hearing. "What is it?" Meg asked. "Wolves upwind. They've caught our scent." Daniel's hand went to the rifle strapped across his back. "How many? 6, maybe 7, hungry?" Beth's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, reporting information without apparent fear. "They're deciding if we're worth the risk. Everyone together now." Daniel's voice carried command that brooked no argument. "Anna, Grace behind me. Meg, can you shoot?" "Yes." She'd mentioned it before, but saying it and doing it were different things. Her hands trembled as she took the second rifle Daniel had brought from the wagon's remains. The wolves emerged from the trees like smoke given form. 6 of them, as Beth had said, gray and brown, lean with winter hunger eyes reflecting fading daylight with predatory intelligence. They moved with coordinated purpose, spreading out to surround their potential prey. The lead wolf, larger than the others and bearing scars that spoke of past battles won, approached slowly. Not aggressive yet, but testing, seeing if these humans would run or fight. "Don't shoot unless they charge," Daniel said quietly. "Ammunition is precious, and we might miss in panic. Let them see we're dangerous." Hopefully that's enough. The wolves circled patient as death, waiting for weakness. Grace whimpered behind Meg, and the sound drew the lead wolf's attention. Its focus shifted, zeroing in on the smallest, most vulnerable member of their group. The wolf took a step forward, then another, its lips pulled back, exposing teeth designed for tearing meat from bone. "Now," Daniel said, his voice flat and cold. He fired not to kill, but to warn. The bullet kicked up dirt 3 feet in front of the lead wolf. The crack of the rifle was deafening in the forest silence. The wolf didn't retreat. It snarled, a sound that spoke of hunger stronger than fear. Meg raised her rifle, sighting down the barrel the way her father had taught her 15 years ago in a Philadelphia back lot. Her hands were steady now, fear burning away into focused determination. She would not let these animals harm Grace, would not let this journey end in blood and failure. She fired. The second shot was close enough that dirt sprayed the wolf's face, close enough to make the message unmistakable. The lead wolf paused, reconsidering. Pack animals were intelligent, capable of calculating risk versus reward. 7 wolves against 5 humans with guns was not favorable odds, especially when the humans were willing to fight. Then Beth did something unexpected. She stepped forward, moving past Daniel's protective stance, and spoke directly to the lead wolf. Not in English, but in a series of soft sounds, clicks and low murmurs, a language that seemed to bypass human understanding and speak directly to something older. The wolf's ears pricked forward. Its aggressive posture softened fractionally. Beth continued her strange communication, her small body radiating confidence that should have been absurd, but somehow wasn't. The lead wolf sat back on its haunches, made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal. Then it turned and trotted back into the forest, its pack following with reluctant obedience. They were gone as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only paw prints and the lingering scent of wild things that had chosen mercy over hunting. Daniel lowered his rifle slowly, hands still trembling with adrenaline. "Beth, what did you do?" "I told them we meant no harm, that we were just passing through, that there was easier prey deeper in the forest." She said it as if it was the most natural thing in the world. They understood. "Wolves don't understand human language, Beth." "I didn't use human language." She looked up at her father with eyes that seemed far older than 8 years. "Mama taught me before she died. She said some people can speak to the land and the creatures in it. She said I had the gift." Anna stared at her sister with a mixture of awe and unease. "Mama never told me that." "Because you didn't need to know. Your gift is different. You are meant to teach, to help people learn. Mine is healing and understanding things that don't use words." Grace tugged on Meg's sleeve. "What's my gift?" Beth smiled at her youngest sister. "You see goodness in people, even when they've forgotten how to see it in themselves. That's why Papa's been smiling more since Mama Meg came. You reminded him he was allowed to." The words hung in the twilight air, profound and simple, spoken with the certainty of someone who saw truths that others missed. They made camp in a small clearing, building a fire from dead wood and dried moss. Daniel burned some of Pete Murphy's sage and sulfur mixture, and the acrid smoke seemed to create an invisible barrier that no predator would cross. That night, huddled around the fire with wolves prowling somewhere in the darkness beyond, Meg understood something fundamental. This family was extraordinary, not because they were perfect, but because each member carried gifts that complemented the others. Anna's fierce protectiveness, Beth's uncanny connection to the natural world, Grace's innocent wisdom, Daniel's quiet strength, and her, what gift did she bring? The answer came as she watched Grace fall asleep in her lap, as she helped Anna tend the fire, as she listened to Beth explain which plants growing nearby could be used for medicine. Her gift was seeing them, really seeing them not as charity cases or burdens, but as people worthy of investment and care. Maybe that was enough. Maybe being seen was its own kind of healing. Daniel sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not panicking, for shooting straight when it mattered. My father taught me to shoot before he died, Said a woman needed to know how to protect herself. I never thought I'd actually need the skill. I'm glad you had it. He paused, then added, I'm glad you're here. I know I've said it before, but I mean it more each day. You're holding us together in ways I didn't know we were falling apart. Meg's throat tightened with emotion too complex to name. We're holding each other together. That's what families do. There it was again. That word, family, growing more real each time it was spoken. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire burn down to coals, listening to the forest settle into night sounds. Somewhere out there, wolves prowled. Somewhere ahead, a valley waited. And somewhere between fear and hope, 5 people were becoming something more than the sum of their individual desperation. They were becoming the Whitmores. Not Daniel's family that Meg had joined, but a new configuration. A blended thing built from loss and choice and the stubborn determination to survive. As Meg drifted towards sleep, Grace's weight warm against her, Daniel's presence solid beside her, she thought about the town they'd left behind. Mrs. Brennan's predictions of failure. Silas Blackwell's smug certainty that they'd come crawling back. Let them believe what they wanted. Out here in the wilderness, none of that mattered. What mattered was the child sleeping in her arms, the man beside her learning to trust again. The girls who were slowly, cautiously beginning to call her something that sounded like mother. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were together. They were alive. They were heading towards something that might, if they were very lucky, turn out to be everything Samuel Whitmore had promised. A valley, a refuge, a chance to build something real. The fire crackled its agreement, and Meg let herself believe in possibilities. Dawn broke cold and clear frost glittering on pine needles like scattered diamonds. They broke camp quickly, eager to keep moving, following Beth's unwavering certainty through landscape that grew increasingly rugged with each mile. By mid-morning, they crested a ridge, and Daniel stopped so suddenly that Meg nearly collided with his back. Look, he breathed. Below them, cradled between protective mountain walls on 3 sides, lay a valley that seemed to have been carved from a different world entirely. A creek wound through its center water, catching sunlight and throwing it back in liquid silver. Meadows thick with wild grass stretched green and impossible, fed by underground springs that kept everything lush even in late season. Fruit trees gone semi-wild but clearly planted with intention dotted the landscape. And there near the creek's edge stood a cabin. Not the ramshackle structure Daniel had described from his childhood memories. Not some hunter's lean-to or abandoned prospector's shack. A real cabin, 2-story stone foundation, timber frame, weathered by years but standing solid and true. Beside it, a barn that looked capable of housing a dozen animals. A porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Glass windows that caught the light. That's it, Daniel whispered. That's what Father built. All those years, all that secrecy, and he built something real. Anna's hand found Meg's squeezing tight. It's beautiful. It looks like something from a storybook. Can we live there? Grace asked, her voice small with hope she was afraid to trust. Really live there forever? Let's find out, Daniel said. They descended into the valley, and with each step the world seemed to grow warmer, softer, more welcoming. The air here was different. Protected by the surrounding mountains, sheltered from harsh winds, the valley had created its own microclimate. Wildflowers bloomed in colors that shouldn't have survived this late in the season. Birds sang from branches heavy with fruit. Even the grass seemed greener, thicker, more alive than anything they had seen in miles of travel. The land is singing, Beth said quietly. Can you hear it? It's happy we're here. They approached the cabin, slowly reverent, as if entering a church. The porch boards were solid beneath their feet. The door, when Daniel pushed it open, swung smoothly on hinges that had been oiled recently enough that they didn't squeak. Inside, dust covered everything like a burial shroud, but beneath it, the cabin was extraordinary. The main room was vast, dominated by a fireplace built from river stones fitted so precisely they needed no mortar. A table, handmade but beautifully crafted, sat surrounded by chairs that showed the same careful attention to detail. Shelves lined one wall holding books, dishes, tools, all the necessities of life arranged with meticulous care. Upstairs, Anna called from the loft ladder. There are 3 bedrooms, 3. We can each have our own. Her voice carried wonder that broke Meg's heart. 3 girls sharing one bed their entire lives, and now each could have private space. Such a small thing, such an enormous gift. Beth found the kitchen area running her hands over the cast iron stove with something approaching reverence. This is quality. Real quality. Grandpa Samuel knew what he was doing. Grace discovered a small room off the kitchen, barely more than a closet, but with a window that looked out toward the creek. This can be my room. I can watch the water every morning. Daniel moved through the space like a man in a dream, touching walls his father had built, running his fingers over wood his father had shaped. In the study, he found Samuel's desk organized even in death. Journals filled with entries spanning 3 decades. Ledgers showing taxes paid through a Helena lawyer for another 46 years. Maps detailing every inch of the valley with surveyor's precision. And there, tucked in the desk's bottom drawer, more letters. Sealed envelopes addressed to each granddaughter. Anna, Beth, Grace. Even one marked to Daniel's wife when he finds her. Meg's hands trembled as Daniel passed her the envelope. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded pages covered in that same neat handwriting. To the woman who answered my son's need. I do not know your name or your story, but I know this. You are stronger than you believe. You saw possibility where others saw only failure. You chose love when easier paths beckoned. My son has been broken by loss and guilt. My granddaughters have been starved for the kind of attention only a mother can provide. You are their chance at healing. Do not doubt yourself when times grow hard. You belong here. This valley was built for second chances, and you are proof that second chances can transform everything. Thank you for seeing my family's worth when the world could not. With gratitude and respect, Samuel Whitmore. Meg read the words 3 times, tears streaming unchecked down her face. A dead man she'd never met had seen her and deemed her worthy before she'd even arrived. The validation cracked something open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight since her mother's death. What does it say? Daniel asked gently. That your father was wiser than any of us knew. They spent the afternoon cleaning each family member, attacking dust with determined efficiency. Anna swept floors until they gleamed. Beth washed windows until glass sparkled. Grace helped Meg arrange the kitchen, finding homes for dishes and utensils. By evening, the cabin had transformed from abandoned relic to something that felt tentatively like home. But as night fell and they gathered around the fireplace for their first meal in the valley, Daniel's expression grew troubled. He kept glancing at the journals on his father's desk, clearly wrestling with something he wasn't ready to voice. After the girls were asleep, he pulled out the journals and began reading aloud. Entry after entry detailing Samuel's life in the valley, his careful cultivation of the land, his discovery of the creek's reliable flow, his planting of fruit trees that would feed future generations, and then dated 15 years prior, the entry that changed everything. Found the vein today. Silver. Not surface deposits, but a true vein running deep into the hillside. I tested it. Purity is remarkable. This could make us wealthy beyond measure. But I have seen what wealth does to men. Seen miners tear families apart chasing ore that glitters but does not satisfy. I will take only what I need. No more. The rest can wait for Daniel for when he needs it. If he needs it. Pray God he never does. Daniel's voice shook as he continued reading. Entry after entry detailing Samuel's careful extraction of just enough silver to pay taxes and save for emergencies. His deliberate choice to leave the bulk of the vein untouched. His growing certainty that restraint was wisdom and greed was poison. He found silver, Daniel whispered. All this time we struggled and he had silver sitting here untouched. He was waiting for you to need it, Meg said quietly, saving it for emergencies. This qualifies as an emergency, doesn't it? I need to see it, need to know it's real. The next morning, following coordinates from Samuel's maps, Daniel and Meg left the girls at the cabin and hiked to the eastern hillside. The entrance was concealed behind scrub oak, just as the journal had described. Man-made, carefully disguised, protected by years of growth. Inside, a tunnel extended 30 feet into the hillside, timber supported and surprisingly dry. At the end, a small chamber opened up, and there exposed in the chamber wall was the vein. Silver ran through quartz like frozen lightning, thick as a man's arm, extending in both directions as far as lamplight could penetrate. It was beautiful, terrifying, a fortune made solid, waiting with patient indifference to transform lives or destroy them. Daniel stood before it, lamplight casting shifting shadows across his face. My God, he was right. This could make us wealthy, truly wealthy. Meg approached the vein, carefully running her fingers over the exposed silver. Her mathematical mind, trained by years of accounting for fabric and thread, began automatic calculations. 50 tons conservatively. At current prices, more than $100,000. Enough to buy land cattle, build an empire. Enough to ensure the girls never wanted for anything. Enough to destroy everything if they let it. Your father wrote something in his journal, Meg said softly. He said greed destroys men, that he'd seen it happen, that he chose wisdom over wealth. We could mine this, hire workers, build something substantial. We could, or we could do what your father did. Take only what we need, leave the rest for emergencies, for the girls' futures, for when it truly matters. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached toward the silver, then pulled back. How do we decide? How do we choose between providing for my daughters and not becoming the kind of people who let money poison everything? We asked them. They returned to the cabin and gathered the girls for a family meeting. Daniel explained in terms they could understand what they'd found, what it meant, what choices they faced. Anna's response was immediate. We should mine it. We could have everything we ever wanted. New dresses, books, opportunities. We could hire teachers, go to real schools. But Beth shook her head slowly. Grandpa Samuel left it mostly untouched for a reason. The earth gives what we need, not always what we want. If we take too much, we'll lose something more important. Like what? Anna demanded. Like each other, like the peace in this valley, like knowing we're enough without needing to prove it with money. Grace, who'd been quiet through the discussion, finally spoke. Will we still read together at night if we're rich? Will Papa still have time to teach me things? Will Mama Meg still be Mama Meg? Or will she be too busy being fancy? The question landed with devastating accuracy. They could have wealth, yes, but what would they sacrifice to obtain it? Daniel looked at each face around the fireplace, his daughters watching him with trust he didn't fully deserve. Meg, who'd married him, sight unseen, and somehow become the anchor holding them together. This family he'd been given a second chance to cherish. We farm this valley, he said finally, voice rough with emotion. We mine only what we need for supplies we can't grow or make ourselves. Small amounts sold quietly through Father's contacts in Helena. The rest stays in the ground. Insurance for true emergencies. A legacy for your future's girls, but not a fortune to chase. We build our wealth in land and cattle and good work. Not in silver we hoard like dragons. You're sure? Meg asked, searching his face for doubt. I'm sure. Father spent 18 years proving that having enough is better than having everything. I'd be a fool not to learn from that. Anna looked disappointed but nodded acceptance. Beth smiled with quiet approval. Grace launched herself at her father, wrapping small arms around his neck. I'm glad, she whispered. I like us just how we are. Over the following weeks, they settled into rhythm. Daniel and Meg made a careful trip to Helena, selling just enough silver through Samuel's old contact to purchase quality tools, seed lumber, and 6 head of breeding cattle. They returned with supplies that would last through winter and into spring planting. The valley proved as fertile as Samuel had promised. Crops they planted seemed to grow twice as fast as normal. The fruit trees pruned and tended produced abundant harvests. The creek never slowed, providing endless water for irrigation and livestock. Beth cultivated a garden of medicinal plants, her knowledge expanding as she experimented with local herbs. Anna threw herself into education, devouring Samuel's extensive library and teaching her sisters everything she learned. Grace became the valley's unofficial shepherd, caring for their small herd, with patience that suggested she understood animals in the same mysterious way Beth understood plants. And Meg found her place, not as Catherine's replacement, but as something new. She taught the girls reading and arithmetic beyond what Anna could provide. She kept accounts with precision that ensured they never overextended. She sewed clothes that fit properly, mended what could be saved, and created beauty from scraps. She became, without ceremony or announcement, Mama Meg, not Mama Catherine, not the mama they'd lost, but a different kind of mother built from choice and commitment rather than biology. Her relationship with Daniel deepened slowly, carefully, both of them aware of the fragility of trust rebuilt after profound loss. They worked side by side during the day, establishing the routines that would sustain them through harsh Montana winters. At night after the girls were asleep, they sat by the fire and talked. About Catherine eventually because grief acknowledged was better than grief denied. About Meg's years in Philadelphia, the loneliness she'd carried like a second skin. About hopes for the future that felt for the first time in years achievable. 3 months after their arrival, as autumn painted the valley in amber and gold, Daniel took Meg's hand while they stood on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I should have said weeks ago." "What?" "I'm not just keeping you around because I needed a wife. I'm not grateful out of obligation or convenience." He turned to face her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been since Catherine's death. "I choose you, Meg. Every day I choose you. Not because you're useful or helpful or good with the girls, though you're all those things, but because you make me want to be better. Because when I imagine the future, you're in it. Because somewhere between that train platform and this porch, I fell in love with you." Meg's breath caught. She'd hoped secretly that his feelings might be growing into something beyond partnership. But hearing it spoken aloud was different. It made it real in a way that hope never could. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't expect to. Didn't think I had the capacity after so many years alone. But you and these girls, you showed me what family could be. What love looks like when it's built on choice instead of obligation." He kissed her, then gentle and tentative, asking permission even as he took it. And Meg kissed him back, pouring years of loneliness and weeks of growing affection into the connection. When they pulled apart, both were crying, not from sadness, but from relief, from the profound gratitude of second chances granted and accepted. That night, their marriage became real in the fullest sense. Not a legal arrangement or a practical solution, but a union built on genuine feeling and shared commitment. And in the morning, as Meg lay beside Daniel watching dawn light paint the cabin walls, she understood something fundamental. The town had been wrong. Mrs. Brennan and Silas Blackwell, and everyone who'd predicted her failure, had been spectacularly beautifully wrong. She hadn't made a desperate mistake. She'd found exactly where she belonged. Winter came and passed in relative peace. The cabin proved well-insulated Samuel's careful construction, keeping them warm through Montana's harshest months. They burned through firewood Daniel had spent autumn cutting and stacking. They ate from stores Meg had carefully preserved. They read together by firelight, played games Anna invented, told stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. By the time spring arrived, melting snow and awakening the valley into impossible green, they'd become a unit. Not a father with daughters and a wife, but a family integrated and complete. But spring also brought a stranger. Daniel was working the north pasture when he found signs. Boot prints recent circling the property line. Someone had been watching the cabin from the tree line, watching and calculating. He followed the tracks to their source and found evidence of a camp. Fire pit 2 days old, crushed grass where someone had slept, and most troubling surveying stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals as if measuring boundaries. Someone was planning something, and that something involved their valley. Meg listened to his report with growing unease. Could it be legitimate surveyors? Someone updating county records? This land isn't in county records. Father bought it under a false name, paid taxes through a lawyer in Helena. As far as official documentation goes, this valley barely exists. Then who? The answer came 3 days later when a rider appeared at the valley's entrance. Not threatening, not aggressive, but deliberate in his approach. An old man weathered by years of prospecting, leading a burro laden with mining equipment. Daniel recognized him immediately. The prospector who'd helped them on the road months ago, Pete Murphy. "Mr. Whitmore," Pete called from a respectful distance. "May I approach? I come with warning, not threat." Daniel waved him forward, rifle within reach but not raised. Pete dismounted slowly, joints creaking with age, and approached the porch where Meg and the girls had gathered. "I've been trailing someone," Pete said without preamble. "Fellow named Ned Cooper. He's been asking questions in Helena about valleys north of the settlements, about a man named Samuel Wright who used to sell small amounts of silver through a middleman, about whether anyone knew where that silver came from." Daniel's blood ran cold. And what did people tell him? Most knew nothing, but the middleman, he's old now, memory going. He let slip that the silver came from Red Valley territory. Didn't give specifics, but it was enough. "Cooper's been searching for 3 weeks. Found your old wagon, followed your trail here. He knows this valley exists, and he knows there's silver here. One prospector doesn't constitute a threat, Meg said, though her voice lacked conviction. Pete's expression turned grim. Ned Cooper isn't alone. He's working with someone from your old town. Fellow named Silas Blackwell. Seems Blackwell never forgot about you leaving. Never stopped believing you'd found something valuable. When Cooper came asking questions, they formed a partnership. Cooper provides the prospecting knowledge. Blackwell provides the money and legal threats. Anna's hand found Meg squeezing tight with fear. Beth had gone very still, listening to something beyond the conversation. Grace pressed against Daniel's leg, seeking reassurance he couldn't quite provide. What do they want? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. They want the valley. They want the silver, and they've got a plan to take it. Blackwell's filing a claim dispute saying your father's purchase was fraudulent because it was made under a false name. Says the land should revert to the territory for proper auction. And guess who will be the highest bidder? That's illegal. The deed is legitimate. Taxes have been paid for decades. Legal and illegal don't mean much when you're 3 days from the nearest judge, and Blackwell's got money for lawyers while you've got a family to protect. Pete pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is a copy of the filing. Thought you should see what you're up against. Daniel read the document with mounting fury. Blackwell had twisted facts with impressive creativity, claiming Samuel Whitmore had defrauded the territory, suggesting the false name proved intent to hide stolen property, demanding the land be seized and sold to recover supposed unpaid debts. It was all lies, but lies wrapped in enough legal language to sound credible. What can we do? Meg asked, practical even in crisis. Fight it legally, get a lawyer, challenge the claim, prove the purchase was legitimate and the taxes were paid properly. But that takes time and money, and in the meantime, Blackwell will keep pushing. Or, Daniel prompted, hearing the unspoken alternative, or you prepare to defend what's yours. Because if legal means fail, Blackwell strikes me as the type who might try less legal approaches. Pete's words proved prophetic. 2 weeks later, as Daniel worked the fields, 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley. They didn't descend, just sat there for hours watching, making their presence known, sending a message that couldn't be misunderstood. The next day, 6 riders. The day after, 8. They're trying to intimidate us, Meg said, watching from the cabin window as the distant figures made camp on the ridge. Show us we're outnumbered. Daniel cleaned his rifles with methodical care, checking ammunition, ensuring everything functioned properly. Pete was right. We need to prepare. Over the following days, they transformed the cabin into something defensible. Daniel reinforced windows with shutters he could bar from inside. He cached weapons at strategic points around the property. He taught Anna and Meg better marksmanship, turning afternoon hours into target practice that echoed across the valley like warnings. Beth walked the property line daily, claiming she could sense when intruders crossed onto their land. Grace stayed close to home, her earlier joy replaced by quiet fear. And through it all, the riders watched, counting them, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came on a cold spring morning when Daniel had ridden to the far pasture to check on a sick calf. Meg was in the garden with the girls when she heard horses approaching. Not the usual distant observation, but riders descending into the valley with clear purpose. 6 men led by a face she recognized from town. Silas Blackwell, looking smug and certain, flanked by Ned Cooper, and 4 hired men who wore weapons with the casual comfort of frequent use. Meg got the girls inside quickly, barring the door, loading rifles with hands that shook only slightly. Anna took position at one window, Meg at another. Beth shepherded Grace to the root cellar, then returned to watch through a crack in the shutters. Silas dismounted with theatrical confidence, approaching the cabin as if he owned it already. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called, "we need to talk about this land, about the silver your husband's been mining illegally, about the future of this valley." Meg opened the shutter enough to aim her rifle through the gap. "This land is legally owned. We have deed and tax records. You're trespassing. The deed is fraudulent, filed under a false name. That makes the purchase invalid. The deed was filed properly through a Helena lawyer who can testify to its legitimacy. Your claim won't hold up in court." Silas's smile didn't waver. "Courts take time, Mrs. Whitmore, and accidents can happen to families living in isolated valleys. Tragic accidents, fires, wild animals. Who knows what might befall you before a judge ever hears your case? The threat was clear. Legal or illegal, Silas would have this valley. Leave, Meg said, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. Now, before you do something you'll regret. I don't think you're in a position to make demands. 6 armed men against a woman and some children? The math isn't in your favor. 6-2? A voice called from behind them. Silas spun to find Daniel approaching from the barn, rifle raised and aimed. He'd heard the commotion and circled back through the trees, positioning himself for maximum advantage. Make that 6-3, another voice added. Old Pete Murphy emerged from behind the chicken coop, his own rifle trained on Silas's hired men. Actually, a fourth voice said, this one female and sharp with authority, I'd say the odds just shifted considerably. A woman rode into the clearing, flanked by a dozen men wearing badges that identified them as territorial law. She was perhaps 40, dressed in riding clothes that suggested both wealth and practicality, with eyes that assessed situations with clinical precision. I'm Margaret Hayes, territorial magistrate, and you, Mr. Blackwell, are under arrest for attempted claim jumping, intimidation, and conspiracy to defraud. Silas's confidence evaporated like morning frost. This is absurd. I have legitimate legal claims to this property. You have fraudulent documents filed with forged signatures. I've seen your paperwork, and I've seen the Whitmore family's actual deed and tax records. Josiah Drummond brought them to me 3 days ago, along with a very convincing argument about your history of predatory lending and property theft. Daniel's lawyer, the man Samuel had trusted for decades. He'd been working behind the scenes building a legal defense while they prepared physical defenses. Magistrate Hayes gestured to her men. Arrest them all, Blackwell, Cooper, and anyone who rode with them, knowing this was an illegal action. As the hired men were disarmed and bound, Silas made one final desperate play. You don't understand. There's silver here. A fortune. These people are hoarding resources that should belong to the territory. What these people do with their legally owned property is their business, not yours. The Whitmore family has broken no laws. You, however, have broken several. I suspect you'll have plenty of time to reflect on that in territorial prison. They led Silas away, still protesting, still threatening legal action that everyone knew would never materialize. Ned Cooper went quietly, his shoulders slumped with resignation. The hired men looked relieved to be arrested rather than forced into violence they'd clearly been dreading. When the dust settled and the prisoners were secured, Magistrate Hayes approached Daniel and Meg. Mr. Drummond sends his regards. He's been monitoring Blackwell's activities for years, waiting for the man to overstep badly enough to justify arrest. This claim jumping scheme was exactly the evidence needed. You should be safe now. The court will rule definitively on your ownership, but given the documentation and Blackwell's proven fraud, I don't anticipate any problems. Thank you, Daniel said, emotion roughening his voice. We didn't know anyone was fighting for us. Your father set things up well. Drummond's been protecting this valley from legal predators for 30 years. He takes his responsibilities seriously. She smiled slightly. Also, he mentioned that if you ever need anything, you're to contact him directly. He considers the Whitmore family under his permanent protection. After she left, leading her prisoners back towards civilization and justice, the family stood together in the yard. The threat had come and gone, defeated not by violence, but by preparation and allies they hadn't known they possessed. Pete Murphy packed his burro, preparing to leave now that the danger had passed. Where will you go? Daniel asked. Wherever the next adventure calls. But I'll be back through these parts come spring. Check on you folks. Make sure you are thriving. You're welcome anytime. This valley has room for friends. Pete nodded, understanding the offer for what it was. An open invitation, a place to rest when wandering grew tiresome. That night, gathered around the fire, Grace asked the question they'd all been thinking. Are we safe now? Really safe. Daniel pulled her into his lap, wrapping her in the security of his embrace. Yes, sweetheart, we're safe. The valley is ours legally and permanently. No one can take it from us. Good, Grace said simply and settled into sleep with the absolute trust of a child whose world had been protected. But Meg and Daniel exchanged glances over the children's heads, both understanding that safety was always temporary, always conditional. They'd won this battle, but the world was full of people like Silas Blackwell, people who saw value and wanted to take it. The difference now was that they were prepared. They had allies, they had legal protection, and they had something worth defending. 2 years passed in the valley, measured not by calendars but by growth. Crops planted and harvested. The small herd of 6 cattle had grown healthy and strong. The girls growing taller, stronger, more confident. The cabin expanding as Daniel added rooms and improvements using skills his father had taught him decades ago. Anna turned 13 and began teaching reading to children from a settlement that had formed 20 miles south. Families drawn by rumors of fertile land and honest opportunity. She rode there twice a week carrying her books and her mother's patient teaching style, shaping young minds the way Catherine would have been proud to witness. Beth's garden became legendary. Neighboring homesteaders traveled days to seek her remedies for ailments that baffled traditional doctors. She healed with herbs and knowledge, and that mysterious connection to living things that defied explanation, but produced undeniable results. Grace 8 now could gentle any animal and find lost things with uncanny accuracy. She'd discovered a gift for what Meg privately thought of as practical magic, the kind that made life easier without being showy about it. And Meg carried a secret that made her smile at unexpected moments. She was pregnant, 4 months along, not showing enough yet for the girls to notice, but enough that she and Daniel had shared quiet joy and whispered conversations. A valley-born child, the first Whitmore baby in a generation. Living proof that this family had a future. 5 months later, on a crisp October morning, Meg gave birth to a healthy boy. They named him Samuel James Whitmore, honoring the grandfather who'd made everything possible. Anna held her baby brother with the careful reverence of someone who'd waited her whole life for this moment. Beth whispered healing blessings over his tiny form. Grace declared him the most beautiful baby ever born and appointed herself his personal guardian. Daniel wept holding his son for the first time, understanding finally what his father had meant about legacy. This child would grow up knowing nothing but safety and love, would never understand what poverty felt like or what it meant to go hungry, would inherit a valley built on wisdom rather than greed. It was Anna who suggested they return to the old town. Not permanently, just a visit. She wanted to see Lucy to show her friend what her life had become, to prove that leaving hadn't been running away, but running toward. Please, Papa, just for a day, I want Lucy to know I'm okay. Better than okay. Daniel looked at Meg silently, asking her opinion. She considered carefully. The town held judgment and mockery, but it also held people who'd been kind. The Reverend and his wife. The store owner who'd extended credit even when it was risky. A few others who'd shown small mercies. I think we should go, Meg said finally. Not to prove anything to people like Mrs. Brennan, but to show the girls they have nothing to be ashamed of. That we've built something worth celebrating. They made the journey in a new wagon purchased with silver money and built to last. Good horses, well-fed and healthy, pulled them over roads that seemed shorter than Meg remembered. The landscape that had felt harsh and unwelcoming 2 years ago now seemed merely honest, showing its beauty to those who bothered to look. As they entered town on a bright April morning, heads turned. Conversations stopped. People stared with the same intensity they'd shown when Meg first arrived, but the character of that staring had changed. This wasn't pity or mockery. This was shock laced with something that looked suspiciously like envy. The wagon was new. The horses were prime stock. The family wore clothes that were simple but well-made, no patches visible, than fabric chosen for quality rather than cheapest available. The girls sat tall, confident, radiating health and education that showed in their posture and speech. And Meg, sitting beside Daniel, looked nothing like the desperate mail-order bride who'd stepped off the train 26 months ago. She looked like a woman who'd found exactly where she belonged and knew her own worth. Mrs. Brennan stood on her porch, mouth actually falling open in undisguised astonishment. She recovered quickly, bustling over with false sweetness that fooled no one. Margaret, Daniel, what a surprise, we'd heard you'd left the territory entirely. Moved to California or some such place. We're still in Montana, Meg said calmly. About 3 days north. We've settled well. Settled, but how? Last we heard you were running from debts, living in some wilderness hovel. Daniel's jaw tightened, but Meg placed a calming hand on his arm. She'd handle this. We're farming, good land, reliable water, fertile soil, everything we need to build a life. But surely with no money, how did you afford? We manage, Meg interrupted, her tone, making it clear that financial details were none of Mrs. Brennan's concern. Daniel's father left him resources. We've used them wisely. Other townspeople had gathered now, curiosity drawing them like moths to flame. The banker's wife, the mayor, the merchant who'd once refused them credit, all staring, all reassessing, all struggling to reconcile the failures they'd predicted with the obvious success standing before them. Reverend Cole pushed through the crowd, his face breaking into genuine smile. Daniel, Margaret, girls, it's wonderful to see you all looking so well. Thank you, Reverend. Your kindness when we left meant more than you know. And young Anna, I hear you've been teaching word travels, you know. People speak highly of your work. Anna blushed with pride. Yes, sir. I have 12 students now, reading and arithmetic. Beth helps with natural science lessons. Remarkable. Your mother would be so proud. The words hung in the air, acknowledgement of Catherine, without making Meg feel like she was being erased. It was graciously done, and Meg appreciated the Reverend's care. Lucy appeared, pushing through the crowd with the single-minded determination of a 14-year-old seeking her best friend. The girls collided in an embrace that spoke of months of separation and letters that couldn't quite bridge the distance. You look amazing, Lucy exclaimed, pulling back to study Anna with wide eyes. Like you've been eating actual meals. We have been, 3 times a day, sometimes 4. Mama Meg's an excellent cook. The casual use of Mama Meg didn't go unnoticed. Meg saw several women exchange glances, reassessing yet again. This wasn't a desperate stranger enduring charity. This was a mother accepted and loved. Silas Blackwell's name came up inevitably. Someone asked with poorly disguised curiosity whether they'd heard about his arrest and conviction. We heard, Daniel said simply. The magistrate came to our valley to tell us the court had ruled permanently in our favor. Our land is legally ours, free and clear, with documentation that can't be challenged. Your valley, the mayor asked. What valley is this? Private property, Meg interjected smoothly. We prefer to keep its location confidential. For the girls' safety. The implication was clear. They'd been threatened once. They wouldn't risk it happening again by advertising their location to every opportunist within 100 miles. After an hour of catching up and deflecting intrusive questions, they prepared to leave. They'd accomplished what they came for. Anna had seen Lucy. They'd proven they were thriving. They'd shown the town that its judgment had been premature and wrong. As they climbed back into the wagon, Mrs. Brennan made one final attempt at control. Well, Margaret, perhaps, now that you've found some prosperity, you'll be moving back to civilization. Those girls deserve proper schooling, proper society. Meg turned, meeting the woman's eyes with calm certainty. Those girls have everything they need. Education from books and experience. Society with people who value them. And most importantly, they have family. A father who loves them, sisters who support each other, and me. We don't need your approval or your civilization. We have something better. We have home. She said it without anger or defensiveness, simply stating facts that needed no embellishment. Mrs. Brennan had no response. Neither did anyone else. They just watched as the wagon rolled away, carrying a family that had transformed failure into success through nothing more miraculous than hard work and love. The journey home felt shorter than the journey out. The girls chattered about seeing friends, about how small the town felt now, about how happy they were to return to the valley. As they crested the final ridge and the valley spread before them golden in late afternoon sun, Grace sighed with contentment. Home, she said simply. And it was. The cabin stood, solid smoke rising from the chimney where they'd left the fire banked. The creek sang its eternal song. The cattle grazed peacefully. The garden showed early green promise of summer abundance. Everything exactly as they'd left it. Everything exactly as it should be. That night, after the girls were asleep, Daniel and Meg sat on the porch watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Your father's letter, Meg said quietly, the one he wrote to me. He said this valley was built for second chances. He was right. Second chances for me, for the girls after losing Catherine. Daniel paused, then added, for you too. You gave up everything familiar to come here. I didn't give up anything worth keeping. I gained everything worth having. She placed his hand on her belly where new life grew, including this, our future, a child who'll never know anything but being wanted and loved. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. A baby. Our baby. Father would have loved knowing his valley would be filled with grandchildren. It will be. Anna will marry someday, bring her husband here if he's smart. Beth will find someone who understands her gifts. Grace will charm some poor, unsuspecting young man. This valley will ring with children's laughter for generations. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the valley settle into night. Tomorrow would bring work. Planting, tending, building, teaching. The endless cycle of seasons and growth. But tonight was for gratitude. For acknowledging how far they'd come from that train platform where 37 people had judged a mail-order bride and found her wanting. Those people had been wrong. Spectacularly beautifully wrong. Meg hadn't been desperate. She'd been brave. Brave enough to answer an advertisement. Brave enough to stay when leaving would have been easier. Brave enough to love children who weren't hers by blood, but became hers through choice. And Daniel hadn't been a failure. He'd been a father protecting his daughters the only way he knew how. Working himself to exhaustion. Accepting help when pride would have refused it. Learning to trust again after loss had taught him that trust was dangerous. Together, they'd built something real. Not perfect, but honest. Not wealthy, though they had enough. Not free from challenges, but equipped to face them. Samuel Whitmore had given them more than land and silver. He'd given them possibility. The chance to prove that second chances weren't just empty words, but real opportunities for transformation. 3 days north of judgment and mockery, hidden in a valley that maps barely acknowledge, the Whitmore family had found what everyone searches for and few ever discover. They'd found home. Real home. The kind built on love and choice and stubborn determination to make things work, despite every reason they shouldn't. From inside the cabin came a soft cry, little Samuel waking from his nap calling for his mother. Grace's voice followed gentle and soothing singing, the same lullaby Meg had sung to her on that first wagon ride years ago. The sound made Meg's heart swell. 3 daughters and now a son. A family built from fragments held together by choice and love and stubborn determination. And that, Meg thought as Daniel kissed her softly and they rose to go inside, was worth more than all the silver in the mountains. The town had mocked her for marrying a poor widower with 3 daughters. They'd been wrong about everything. She'd married a good man who was teaching her what partnership meant. She'd gained 3 daughters who'd opened her heart in ways she'd thought impossible. She'd found a valley that provided everything they needed and most of what they wanted. And she'd discovered that sometimes the worst decisions everyone else can imagine are actually the best decisions you could possibly make. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled its agreement. Tomorrow their life would continue. Simple, honest, filled with the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in silver or counted in coins. The wealth of family, of purpose, of belonging. The mail-order bride had found her place, and the valley would keep her secret, protecting the family that protected it for as long as stars shone over Montana mountains.